Welcome to this video on Othello by Shakespeare, and this continues on from the previous video which looked at the very start of Act 1 Scene 1. Today we're going to look at part 2, so the second half of Act 1 Scene 1. And in the last video I introduced the idea that we always need to be thinking about the big question, the key concepts in the play. And I use these pictures to illustrate how we constantly need to be oscillating, to be moving between the kind of bigger questions about society and the details of the play which are going to support how we respond to those questions. And today's question is, how and why does Shakespeare establish the inherent racism of Venetian society? Because the first scene of the play is deeply racist, and for a modern audience it can be very troubling and very uncomfortable to watch, particularly due to the language that Iago uses at the end of Act 1. Now, in terms of the plot so far, where we're at in the play, we've had the very start, which is set at night time, and Iago and Rodrigo are talking in the street where everyone's, very nicely asleep around them. And then in this scene, Iago and Rodrigo wake up Brabantio and tell him that Othello and Desdemona have eloped together, that they've got married. So just a little bit of historical context before we look too closely at the racism of this scene. This is an old copy of the play, and you can see that the title I've highlighted there is The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. So the original audience of the play would have been told from the very title that Othello is the Moor. And so when Iago and Rodrigo come on in Act 1 Scene 1 and they're talking about this person and we don't quite know who he is, the audience would have had a sense from the title of the play that this is a person called Othello that they're talking about, and that one of the reasons they don't like him is due to their racism, because Othello was a Moor and he's identified as that throughout the first act of the play. And a Moor would have been someone from probably the north of Africa. There's been a lot of debate over time as to whether Othello was black or whether he wasn't, whether this is a reference to a religion rather than to a race. But the way Othello is generally played in the modern theatre is as a black character, and there are lots of references to him as that, especially in this opening scene. And when reading the title, the Renaissance audience would have had a particular stereotype in mind. And I've taken a quotation here from a literary critic called Dickinson. This was written in 2015. And Dickinson says there was a strong tradition on the Elizabethan stage of black characters being played as snarling villains. And anxiety about black immigration into Britain was such that Elizabeth I issued several proclamations ordering the expulsion of blackamoors from her realm. And of course that's Elizabeth I's word there. Now this tells us that the society at the time that Shakespeare was writing would have been deeply, deeply racist, very suspicious of people from other cultures, and that as part of that racism, people from other cultures would have been stereotyped on the stage. They would have been reduced. Their individuality, their identity, their humanity would have been stripped away, and we would have been left with a kind of stock character. And for a black character on stage, that meant someone who was villainous through and through. And our reading of Act 1 Scene 1 kind of reinforces that idea, and definitely lots of people would argue that Shakespeare himself would have been quite racist, kind of based on the way that Iago and Rodrigo engage in this kind of stereotyping of Othello in Act 1 Scene 1. However, when Othello enters in Act 1 Scene 2, Shakespeare challenges these racist preconceptions. And we'll look at that in the next video. But that leaves us with the question, why then, if Shakespeare was going to challenge this racism, does he introduce this idea in the first place? Why does he establish the inherent racism of Venetian society in Act 1 Scene 1? Well, let's look first at how he does it. So, in the last video, I kind of left you at the moment when Rodrigo and Iago were wakening Brabantio up when they were calling up to the window. And so Brabantio appears above at a window and he says, "What is the reason of this terrible summons? What is the matter there?" Rodrigo says, "Signor, is all your family within?" So being very polite. Brabantio elevated at the window is obviously of a much higher class, and the staging of this scene reflects that. So Rodrigo and Iago in the kind of chaos, the lower social position of the street. Brabantio is in a very nice house. He's visually above them at the window, and so Rodrigo is being very polite to him. Iago isn't. He says, "Are your doors locked?" And Brabantio says, "Why? Wherefore ask you this?" So he's just woken up. He's clearly very confused. And Iago says, "Zounds, sir, you're robbed. For shame, put on your gown." So Iago is deliberately trying to ramp up the emotion in this scene and to make everybody panic. He says, "Your heart is burst. You've lost half your soul. So your daughter has run away. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tapping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. Arise, I say." And Brabantio responds, why do you tell me about robbing? This is Venice. My house is not a grange, and a grange would have been a house in the countryside. So Brabantio is saying, these kind of things can't happen in the city. You know, this is a place of order and of law, and this kind of elopement or theft wouldn't take place here. So we've talked about Brabantio being above at the window, being elevated in that social status. And then here, if we look at the difference between what Rodrigo says and what Iago says, it's quite interesting. So as I've said previously, Rodrigo's being very polite. He's addressing Brabantio using his title, Signor, and he, asks quite a polite question, "Is your family within?" And Iago kind of goes for the, I suppose, a tabloid headline here, "Are your doors locked?" So much more emotive here, implying that something dreadful has happened. And then zounds would be a kind of curse word. And Iago does say "sir," so he does have a level of politeness, but he's incredibly direct, whereas Rodrigo's kind of talking around the situation. Iago goes straight for the jugular here. And now, very now, so the repetition of that word increases the tension, the anxiety, the urgency that some kind of action needs to be taken to stop a disaster from taking place. And then Iago says what this disaster is. An old black ram is tapping your white ewe. Now, the racism of that statement cannot be ignored by a modern audience. So Iago draws attention to how old Othello is. And we assume that Othello's maybe about 40 years old, whereas Desdemona's probably kind of 20s, late teens maybe. And Iago describes Othello as being black. So as I talked about, he's reducing Othello to purely just his ethnicity. He's stripping away that individuality and that identity. And ram. Now, this is very animalistic language that's being used, and that would have been one of the kind of common tropes of racism, even still today, describes people in these animalistic, these bestial terms. And then tapping is quite an explicit term. Basically, Othello is having sex with Desdemona. But tapping places Desdemona in a very passive position, suggesting that in some way she's being molested or assaulted, that perhaps she isn't consenting to this. And of course, in Act 1, Scene 3, we see that she has agreed to marry Othello, that in fact she's probably made the first move in this relationship. And then we have the juxtaposition of black and white here. And Iago is clearly, in a very racist way, suggesting that this shouldn't happen, that this relationship is not socially acceptable. And that pronoun your indicates that Desdemona should belong to her father still, that this marriage hasn't been agreed by the father, it's not legitimate marriage, and she is still the possession of her father. And of course, there's a lot of indications there that this is a patriarchal society, that in some way Desdemona should be owned by other people. And then Iago describes Othello as being a devil, and this is another common trope of racist language, that there's a connection between people who are different, and between immorality, between malevolence. And so Iago's using this quite religious language here in a very emotive way, and he suggests that Othello is going to make Brabantio a grandfather after he sleeps with Desdemona. So Iago continues by really increasing the sense of drama here and really building this up into a very emotive climax of the scene. And he says to Brabantio, "Sign, sir, you're one of those that will not serve God if the devil bid you, because we have come to do you service, and you think we are ruffians? You'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse. You'll have your nephews neigh to you. You'll have courses for cousins and jennets for Germans." And Brabantio replies, "What profane wretch art thou?" So it's quite interesting here. Iago has lapsed from blank verse into prose. So blank verse is where you've got iambic pentameter, so 10 syllables in a line, and it normally doesn't rhyme. But it's a very kind of orderly, polite, sophisticated way of speaking. Whereas prose is just normal speech. If you look at the way it appears on the page in front of you, on the screen in front of you, you'll see that there's no capital letters at the starts of the lines. We don't have 10 syllables in each line. There's no sense of rhythm at all, in the sense of that iambic pentameter rhythm. So what Iago's doing here is he's kind of falling into a very chaotic way of speaking, and he doesn't speak in that sophisticated, polite way that we might expect when someone's talking to someone higher above them in the social system. And again, he's being very racist. The reference to a Barbary horse, again, that animalistic language there. And it's just so kind of debased and profane in terms of what he's saying to Brabantio. And Brabantio, when he says, "What profane wretch art thou?" he shows that he doesn't know who Iago is. He doesn't know Iago's name, and that's really important. Brabantio does know Rodrigo, he does recognise Rodrigo, and so he can pin the blame for this on Rodrigo, but he doesn't know Iago, and he never finds out Iago's identity in this scene because Iago scarpers before Brabantio comes out of his front door. And Iago kind of leaves Rodrigo to sort things out. So this is really kind of building up Iago's duplicity, the fact that he's concealing his identity when he's trying to kind of carry out his plans. And Iago says, "I am one, sir, that comes to tell you your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. So your daughter is having sex with her new husband." And Brabantio says, "You're a villain." And this would have got a really good laugh from the audience in Shakespeare's day. Iago says, "You're a senator." So what he's saying here is that as a politician, you're a kind of villain as well. And we're used to that kind of language in the modern world. If you think about satirical programmes, Have I Got News for You or Dead Ringers or whatever on the BBC, where political figures like Donald Trump are mocked for their kind of characteristics and so on. And so Iago's making a political joke here, and the audience would have found it quite funny. So we've had this huge build-up of drama, of emotive language, and a very racist language, and then we've got Iago undercutting that, and that's a technique called bathos. So bathos is where something very serious is happening, and then you say something kind of really down to earth, which undercuts the whole thing, and it's quite funny for that reason. And just zooming in on this quotation here, your daughter and the Moor are making the beast with two backs. So again, your daughter, you know, that pronoun your shows that she should belong to Brabantio. And the Moor, again, not giving Othello a name, but talking about him in terms of his race. And then that bestial language, the beast with two backs. And that idea of the two backs, you know, we're talking about sexual union in a very profane, very debased way here. It's very different from what Othello says at the start of Act 2, Scene 1, where he talks about his relationship with Desdemona in very idealistic terms. He says, "You're my soul's joy." You know, it's very kind of emotional, idealistic, perfectionist, but also very unphysical in the way their relationship is at the start of that act. So looking at some vocabulary then that we need to know to talk about this scene. Firstly, xenophobia. So it's a fear and hatred of strangers or those who are foreign. So Iago is very xenophobic in this scene. He talks about Othello in a xenophobic fashion. Prejudiced, again, linking into that, so holding a preconceived judgment about another person. often poorly thought through and based on mistaken beliefs. So Iago is prejudiced towards Othello. Iago wants to bring about Othello's downfall because he is prejudiced towards him. And prose as well, I've already spoken about that. So an independent learning task for you to complete based on the second half of Act 1, Scene 1. I want you to write an analytical paragraph to respond to this question. And this is our big question for today. How and why does Shakespeare establish the inherent racism of Venetian society? So you'll see that I've got a vocabulary checklist here down the side with some of our keywords, and I've got an excellence criteria checklist for what I want you to include in each section of your paragraph. So thank you very much for listening, and the next video is going to be looking at Act 1, Scene 2.